Welcome to Spotlight on the Arts. I'm Patrick Christiano, your host, the publisher of TheaterLife.com, a website for theater buffs covering Broadway and off-Broadway theater. And I have a really special guest today, someone I just met and I am learning a lot about. He's an author, mostly biographies, and he's a theater critic. He's a chief theater critic for the Warp in California. And he's written a new book, The Way They Were, about the making of the classic movie, The Way They Were. Robert Hofler. Robert, thank you so much for coming.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. Good to be here.
Oh, it's really exciting to have you. I only got to dip into your book, and I'm going to confess I didn't finish it yet, but I can't wait to finish it. I took the flu shot and the COVID shot, and kind of gave me a bad reaction and stole my time that I was going to read. But I've read, the beginning of it. You set it up. It's amazing. There's so many facts, so many details. They bombard you with things that are so interesting. How do you research something like that? Where do you start?
Well, luckily, Sidney Pollack, who directed the movie, and Arthur Lawrence, who wrote the screenplay, had their archives at the Academy Library in Beverly Hills. That was Pollack. And Arthur Lawrence had his archives at the I'm blanking now. Suddenly, it's the archives in Washington D.C. I'm blanking.
There's the archives, and you got them. It's all right.
Yeah. Okay. And they kept all of their memos and letters back and forth with each other, and also with the producer Ray Stark. So,
and let's tell everyone they don't know. Ray Stark also produced Barbara's first movie, Funny Girl, and she had a 4-picture contract. Was it 4 pictures?
4 pictures.
So he kind of owned Barbara a little bit at this moment, in a way.
He actually had an ownership thing. That's what people referred to. And so that created real problems for them. But the book was fairly easy to research because there was such a paper trail. And also I got interviews with Streisand and Robert Redford, and that helped a great deal. I was able to find the film editor for John Burnett.
Did you get to do these interviews with Redford and Streisand recently, or did you do them a while back?
No, they were done for the book.
So they were recent interviews that they came forward. Oh, how cool. That's really exciting, huh?
And it was particularly interesting because Redford had not talked about the movie very much. Streisand had talked about the movie a great deal, but Redford hadn't, because basically he didn't want to make the movie. And I think what it came down to is that he trusted his friend Sidney Pollack to make changes in the screenplay so that he felt at least comfortable playing the role. But of course, that meant that Arthur Lawrence had to be fired from the project, even though it was his story. And as Arthur Lawrence told me later on, and that was not a recent interview, that was an interview I did in maybe 2003 or something, that he was basically writing about himself with the Katie character.
But Barbara Streisand felt had a little of her in there too, didn't she?
Well, she felt she did. Arthur Lawrence, though, told me, and he later wrote about it in his third memoir, that basically the Katie character is me. But with Streisand, she thought that he was tailoring a lot of it to her. My feeling is that Arthur Lawrence and Barbara Streisand were very, very similar people. I mean, they even went to the same high school in Brooklyn.
I agree with you 100%. I think their spirits kind of merged a little bit
yes.
into the character.
Yes.
Into the character. And in the beginning of the book, you talk about how it all came to be and how how Barbara she wasn't like Ray Stark's first choice for Funny Girl, and how his wife really wanted someone completely different. So had that not happened, we might not have ever got Barbara Streisand in The Way We Were.
Well, before Funny Girl on Broadway, Arthur Lawrence had cast Streisand in her first Broadway show, which is I Can Get It For You Wholesale.
Right.
And so she was on a lot of people's radar. I think without that show, she would not have been cast. But I think after that show, and also the other serious contenders.
Now, Arthur directed that show. Am I right? Arthur
he directed that show. He cast her in it.
And it was the first time he directed, right?
And he directed it. He did not write it. That was a real.
For our viewers, he wrote West Side Story and Gypsy. Because a lot of people might not be aware of that. You never know.
And then he went on much later in his life to direct Broadway revivals. I think he directed 3 Broadway revivals of Gypsy and 1 Broadway revival of West Side Story.
Oh, wow.
But this was his big chance to direct. And he remained very friendly with Streisand, even though he was very critical of her. He was very critical of her performance in Wholesale. He thought that she never set the performance, that she changed every night, and he didn't like that. And then also he didn't like her first album. And there was a letter that I found in his collection, in his archives, a pencil-written letter from Streisand to Lawrence in like 1974 or something. I think her album came out
in the archives. Do they have the original letter in the archives when you go through
the original letter? And she had written that he was critical of her singing on her first album, and he said she was imitating Lena Horne. And she says, "I've never even heard Lena Horne sing, so how can I imitate her?" But of course, everyone was crazy about that first album. And here's Arthur Lawrence going like, "You're imitating somebody else." And she wrote that she believed he wrote the letter to hurt her, but that she still respected him. And she asked then, and I think this was 1963. I think I just said 1974. It was 1963. And she said, "Would you write something for me?" So, and it was Ray Stark who went to Lawrence and said, "Would you write something for Barbra Streisand? You know, she's got 2 more pictures." He had produced Funny Girl and The Owl and the Pussycat. And so The Way We Were was her 3rd film. Her 4th and last film was Funny Lady, which she never wanted to do. But he wrote a 120-page treatment before he wrote the screenplay. Now, a 123-page treatment is a long treatment. And I think what he was essentially doing was writing the novel, The Way We Were, which was published only 6 months later. It was published in, I think, March of 1972. The movie came out in October of 1973. So wow. I think what he gave her was probably a rough draft for the novel. But both she and Ray Stark loved it immediately.
Yeah, and she said in your book, she said, "This is the next movie I want to make."
This is the next movie.
Having an Oscar under her belt really gets the movie made, doesn't it?
Yeah. So the movie was always going to be made. I mean, the big question was who to direct it. And they immediately thought of Sydney Pollack, because Sydney Pollack started as an acting coach.
I didn't know that. That's fascinating.
Yeah. With Sanford Meisner. Who was very, very famous, you know, who you've heard of The Method, you know, and it was like the Actors Studio, and then there was Meisner, and I'm trying to think there's also a woman acting coach whose name escapes me. But they were the ones who
Uta Hagen and Alice Spivak.
Yes, one of those. And so they thought of Sydney Pollack for that reason, and he had also had a major success with Jane Fonda. That before Jane Fonda had done They Shoot Horses, Don't They, with Sydney Pollack, no one had really taken her seriously as a dramatic actress, and that was her first Academy Award nomination. So Pollock and Lawrence and even Streisand thought, he is the director to turn me into this dramatic actress. And then the thing was, well, who's going to be Hubble? And everyone immediately wanted Robert Redford, and Robert Redford was shown the treatment in December of 1972. Remember, Streisand and Pollock only saw it in like September of 1972. So they immediately sent, or a couple months later, sent the treatment to Robert Redford, and Robert Redford hated it. He said, this is just a Ken doll. He has no point of view. The part isn't big enough, because it was very much a supporting role originally. And then they spent the next 8 months trying to convince Redford, and their backup was Ryan O'Neal, that Ryan O'Neal would play it as written. And the bad news for Lawrence was that as soon as Redford said yes, he got fired. And they brought on Alvin Sargent and
now they brought on who? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Alvin Sargent, who went on to adapt the screenplay of Ordinary People. And of course, Ordinary People is the movie that Redford, his directorial debut, and he won an Oscar. And then there was also another screenwriter, David Raphael. And he was someone who worked on a number of Sidney Pollack movies. And they brought on other people also. They showed it to Dalton Trumbo. They showed it to Francis Ford Coppola. You know, all of those people made suggestions or changes. But basically, it was Sargent and Raphael.
Now, let's back up again. I missed it. Why did they take Lawrence off of it? What was it? Why did they fire him?
There were a number of memos I read that he wasn't making the appropriate changes
that Redford wanted.
that they wanted.
The Redford wanted, basically.
Yeah, and basically that Redford wanted. But basically, Redford signed on before. Is this siren bothering you?
No. Oh, I can't hear
fine.
it.
Oh, okay, good.
I can't hear it.
Good. I could talk over it, but I live on a busy street.
Well, we can't hear it. I can't.
He just wasn't making the changes that Pollock wanted, that Pollock knew Redford wanted. But Pollock was very protective of Robert Redford, and Lawrence kept on saying, well, let me talk to Robert Redford so I know what he wants. And Pollock was like, no, you can't talk to Redford. And maybe Redford didn't want to speak to Lawrence. I don't know. But anyway, he had to be fired. And most of the changes that were made by Raphael and Sargent and others had to do with the Hubble character. They gave him more of a point of view, and they beefed up the role.
Well, I'm sure they made the film better. I'm sure if they hadn't done that, it wouldn't have been the same film that we have. I mean, now we know it wouldn't have been the same film, but it wouldn't have been wouldn't have worked as well.
Well, if you want to know what the original film would have been, you can read Arthur Lawrence's novel, The Way We Were, which was published in 1972. And I have to tell you, it's not a good novel. And Hubble is very much a supporting character, and he's just this kind of Ken doll. And the major scene that they wrote was at the Union Station in Los Angeles, where Katie and others have come back from Washington, D.C., after protesting the House of Un-American Activities, and they get thrown into a cafeteria at the train station, and somehow miraculously the cafeteria is empty. But anyway, they have their fight, and she says people are their principals, and that was an Arthur Lawrence line. But Hubble goes on to explain, why don't we just forget about all of this? Because these people, these screenwriters who are being blacklisted, in 10 years, they're going to be having affairs with the producers' wives, and the producers are going to be hiring them. And it won't make any difference what we do now. So why don't we just forget about all of this and not have it affect our lives? I'm completely paraphrasing. But
Right.
that was important to Redford because it showed that he had a point of view. Uh, and he thought it made Katie stronger.
It
Um,
does.
and Pollock had said that Katie sees what is in front of her and wants to solve the problem now. Hubble takes the more existential, longer view. Well, in 10 years, what difference is all of this going to make? And actually, that is what happened for some people like Dalton Trumbo. Dalton Trumbo, then 10 years after he was in jail, he got a screen credit for writing Spartacus and Exodus. And his career went on as it did before. Now, that wasn't true of everyone. There were
Right.
people like Zero Mostel who lost his movie career and then switched to Broadway. And there were people like Jules Dassin and Joseph Losey who had to leave Hollywood and they started making movies in Europe. And there were other people who committed suicide. And there were people like, I'm trying to think of the actor, John Garfield, who had a heart attack and died.
It was a political period that really was devastating to more than most of the community that was Jewish at the time or was outed in that period.
Well,
And
it was very much, if you look at the names of the people who were blacklisted, it was primarily Jewish.
right. I mean, and that's irrelevant. I mean, when you think back on the film, it's almost if you forgot. When I think back on the film, it's something I almost forgot about how important that is in the film. I remember the romance, and I forget the conflicts until I get into your book, and I go, oh yes, oh yes, oh yes. It's constantly every sentence in it is eye opening. It's just wonderful writing. I can't wait. I want to read everything you've written, and I want to share with my audience too. Some of the things you wrote. The Man Who Invented Rock Hudson was a 2014 book that sounds fascinating. Uh,
Yes, that was the one that Ryan Murphy used some of it for his series Hollywood because it's about the agent Henry Wilson.
and there's another book, Explosion, Warhol to the Making of the Midnight Cowboy.
No, it was to the making of
Clockwork Orange. I'm sorry,
Clockwork Orange. And those are set in the years from 1968 to 1972. And that's when most of the sexual taboos were gotten rid of. That all of a sudden you could use four-letter words. There was more nudity. The subject matter increased. You had more gay subjects. You had more just sex subjects in general. So it was about that, and not only in the movies, it also had to do with like Broadway musicals like Hair, plays like The Boys in the Band, novels like Myra Breckenridge and Couples and Portnoy's Complaint. So it really took in that whole community of people, and a lot of those people knew each other. And they were all trying to be the first to do this or do that, the first one to show pubic hair, the first one, to use the F word, all of these things. So that was a fun book to write.
So it was a big competition to be amongst the rebels to be the biggest rebel, right?
Yes.
And there's another one, Party Animals, about Alan Parr. Is he the main focus of that? Am I correct?
Yeah, he's the main focus because that was a real roller coaster life. And I called it Party Animals because he really got his start in Hollywood as an agent and as a manager. He used to give these wild parties at his house in Beverly Hills. And that was quite unusual in the early 70s because of the murder of Sharon Tate. That when the Manson family killed her in the late 60s, Hollywood just closed up. And he was the first to kind of bring back these wild parties. And then he went on to produce Grease, which was a huge hit. And then he produced La Cage aux Folles on Broadway. And then he produced the worst Oscar ceremonies ever, the one with Snow White. Although if you look at it now, it doesn't look so bad. But at the time, it ended his career in Hollywood. So it was a real roller coaster ride.
Oh, wow.
Oh, he also did Can't Stop the Music, which was the worst movie ever made.
That was not that. I remember that. Now, one of these is being made into a documentary. Is it Party
Party
Animals?
Animals was made into a documentary.
It has been made already.
Yes, yes.
Someone could see that.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
And someone has optioned Money, Murder, and Dominic Dunn, which
oh
I
yeah.
think would make a very good limited TV series because you could follow him on each of his
Oh, that's
murder
fast.
cases, whether it's the Menendez brothers, or it's O.J. Simpson, or it's Phil Spector. And so every week there could be another murder case that Dominic Dunn is there as the reporter covering.
Oh,
So
that's
I hope
fabulous.
that gets made.
Oh, I do too. I'd love to see it.
Yeah.
Dominic Dunn is someone I'm always fascinated with. He's a very intriguing character. He must be a lot of fun to write about too.
Well, he was very intriguing to me because I think when you're a journalist, and he was a journalist for Vanity Fair, he was their most popular writer for over 10 years, more like 20 years. Um, but he had a big secret. He was exposing all of these secrets of famous people, but he, led had this heterosexual facade where he was this gay man. And whenever anyone brought that subject up, he would just completely freak out. So I'm always kind of like, how can you be a journalist, a truth teller, and yet be in the closet and lie about yourself and expect other people to kind of follow that lie? So I found that he was a very interesting person to write about.
Yeah, I agree with you about that, too. You just have there's an authenticity that gets lost if you're not going to
Yes.
be who you are.
Yeah.
You're not freed in any kind of way. Uh, yeah, and I just want to tell everyone you were the senior editor at Variety for 15 years and Life magazine before that. So you have really got a really
I
rich
prefer my
career.
life as a biographer to my life as an editor.
Oh, well,
I
yes, yeah.
still have nightmares
It's like babysitting,
about
right?
being in a newsroom
The
and
little
having deadlines and fighting with other editors and reporters. So I much prefer kind of being on my own.
Oh, well, you've earned the right, and your work certainly is just marvelous. I really I'm not going to this is the last time I'm going to say it, but I really look forward to finishing
Oh,
the
well, thank you
book.
very much.
I'm going to carry it with me until it's done.
You had talked about recent interviews I did for the book as opposed to interviews that I just happened to do and then I was able to recycle for this book. I mean, Arthur Lawrence, my interview with him, which was done 20 years ago.
Right, right,
I
right.
was able to use those quotes. But the other major interview I did was with Sidney Pollack in 1995. And I asked him about, is it really true that in the Hollywood section of the movie about the blacklist, that an hour of the movie was cut out? And he said, yes, that's true because it didn't work. And I said, well, is there going to be a director's cut of the movie? And he said, absolutely not. The material didn't work on the blacklist. So it's interesting because I've had, since the book has come out, there have
Right.
been in various places screenings of the movie, and I talk, and the audiences do find that the Hollywood section, as opposed to the section in the 30s when Katie and Hubble are at college and they meet, or opposed to the 40s during World War II where they're in New York City, that they find the Hollywood section a little choppy. And that's because there was an hour taken out of the movie, and I did a very interesting interview with the editor of the movie, and he said I really liked those sequences on the blacklist, but it became a movie about the blacklist. And we realized all we needed was that Katie had to have another cause. In the 30s, she had Franco in Spain. In the 40s, she had the blacklist, and in the 50s, she had Ban the Bomb. So it really wasn't necessary to go into all of that. However, that said, Barbara Streisand to this day is trying to put two scenes back into the movie that
Wow.
Sidney Pollack refused to put back in. And he said, we had a conversation that went on for 30 years about this. He said that after only they had a conversation for 20 years, but maybe it felt like 30 years.
Well, do you think they'll ever do it?
No, I don't think it will ever, because I think it would have been done for the 50th anniversary, which is like next month.
Okay.
And I think a major stumbling block was Sidney Pollack's two daughters. And I had interviewed them. And while they didn't give me a definite no on the added scenes, they said that they felt they should respect their father's final cut. And he obviously did not want those scenes back in.
I guess so. I think we're going to have to stick with it then. And one interesting aside, we only have a couple of minutes left, but I thought it was interesting too that Robert Redford, who didn't want to do this film initially, if I remember correctly, was open to doing a sequel, and it never happened. Is that correct?
Well, the sequel never happened, and Redford told me that he never wanted to do a sequel. So I was surprised that there was, when I went and researched this, that there were so many stories like, oh, Robert Redford and Barbara Streisand are ready to sign to do a sequel, where Redford said, I never wanted to do.
No, it wasn't true then. It's not true.
Streisand wanted to, and Lawrence did write a screenplay, and other people wrote a screenplay. But I don't think a sequel would work, because at the end of the movie, she's gone to having her hair being kind of frizzy again. She's not straightening it. Right. And she has learned her lesson that she gave up too much of her life to fall in love with the vapid, gorgeous wasp. And her current husband is David X. Cohen. I mean, she had to fight for that line. David X. Cohen. Why the X? It's the only one in the telephone book. She had to fight for that. So basically, she realizes even with Robert Redford, she made a mistake.
Robert, we're out of time. We have about 10 seconds. We didn't get to talk about any of the current theater that I was going to get around to, because that's so interesting. You'll have to come back. Would you come back and talk about some theater another time? I'd love to have you.
And later on in the season, I will have seen more, because Broadway kind of took a hiatus for about a month. So I'm just starting to go back to the theater again.
Yeah, I wanted to catch your views on a couple of things that I saw, and I thought we'd bat it around. But we'll do that next time.
Would love to. Would love to.
Thank you so much for coming to do this. It was my pleasure. It's very insightful.
Thank you.